But here's some of the challenges, and these challenges for sure are true in the United States, but I'd say are probably true everywhere around the world. There's high teacher and leadership burnout, which basically means that the job is so challenging that many people get overwhelmed and feel like they need to leave the profession. We all live in an increasingly complex world, which means that our education settings are increasingly complex. Schools are built within cities and towns, and they reflect what's true and what's happening in those cities and towns. If we had any doubt about that, COVID-19 helped us all to remember it, right? So it's not like we could leave the pandemic at the door and bring kids into the school building and continue on with school as normal. We had to stop and adjust every way that we taught school this last year in order to meet the challenges of the pandemic. And that's true with any other kinds of experiences that are happening in the schools and the communities around us. Our schools are right on the front lines. They're reflecting what's happening in our communities. So it's complex. If you add to that technology, students' ability to access technology and information in increasingly complex ways, it makes it really challenging sometimes to create a safe and inclusive environment for our students. And as I said, the pandemic was a challenge for a lot of us. These are statistics from the United States, although I imagine they're true or reflective of the challenges of educators around the world. But the teachers aren't okay. It was incredibly stressful to move from teaching in person and all of the work that goes into creating a safe and inclusive classroom environment, creating lesson plans that you do live. It was incredibly challenging for teachers to turn all that over and put it all online. It's not a simple task to do. I've been amazingly impressed and inspired and in awe of the educators around the world and how they've met this challenge. And yet meeting this challenge caused more educators to have those feelings of burnout. And in the United States, 28% of educators say that because of the coronavirus alone, they're more likely to leave teaching or retire early. So that's a problem. We need to take care of our educators. They're the most important people we have for educating our students. We want to make sure that they feel happy and connected. This is a quote from Audre Lorde. She was an African-American social justice advocate in the United States. And she said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and it is an act of political warfare. So she was fighting for the rights of African-Americans and women, people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And so she was fighting for civil rights. And that's why she says it's an act of warfare. I'd say for educators, it's an act, this self-care is an act of our ability to stay in the profession. As we just named, teachers are burning out, educators are leaving the profession because it's so challenging. So caring for ourselves, putting ourselves first couldn't be more important. It will allow us to stay in the profession that we love. It will allow us to continue to provide all that we want to provide to our students. So I think often for educators, it can feel difficult to be willing to take care of ourselves. We think that sacrificing ourselves is more important. But in reality, if we want to stay and support our students, we must take care of ourselves. So what is mindfulness? Let's talk a little bit about what it is so we can understand what we're working with here. First, I want to explain two different terms that I think often get confused and mixed together. So the first is meditation. And first, I want to demystify what meditation is. I think a lot of people, when they imagine meditation, they think about that monk that's living up in a cave on a hill somewhere, separated from everyone else, who, been meditating all day. I think oftentimes the image is that of the Buddha, right? So somebody who's often meditating all the time, and they're in this blissed out, very peaceful, very transcendent state. And therefore, when people start to practice meditation and they don't get to that feeling, they feel like they've done something wrong or that they've failed. So I first want to clarify what meditation is and therefore what mindfulness is. So meditation is the practice of returning to the present moment. So the goal of meditation isn't that blissed out, peaceful state. The goal of meditation is the practice of returning to the present moment. What I mean by this is that our minds as humans are built to be traveling all around. We're time travelers all the time. Our minds spend a lot of time in the past ruminating or thinking about something that's happened to us before. both positive and negative, but we often tend to ruminate on the things that were challenging. Or we're in the future anticipating something that's coming up, perhaps thinking about what we're going to have for lunch or worrying about something that might happen down the line. And very rarely do we spend time right here in the present moment, being with and experiencing our feelings right now. When we meditate, we train ourselves to return to the present moment. So we train ourselves to catch those moments when we've gone off time traveling or thinking somewhere and come back to the present moment again. So meditation is a dedicated practice, an intentional practice of catching the mind wandering and bringing the mind back to the present, connecting it back in with the body. Often people do this through focusing on the breath, the body, or sounds. And I actually offer a meditation to do just that. But really, it's just this dedicated practice. So an analogy that can be helpful is like going to the gym. So when we go to the gym, it's with the specific intention of building our muscles or getting more physically fit. We go there with that goal in mind. When we're meditating, it's the same thing. When we're sitting on the cushion, we are intentionally building that practice of returning to the present moment. We are intentionally exercising that muscle of awareness of when we are not in the present moment and bringing ourselves back again. That's meditation. Mindfulness is maintaining present moment awareness as we go about our day and live our lives. So we have an awareness of our thoughts, our feelings, our bodily sensations while we're living our lives. So if we were to keep with this physical activity or health analogy, mindfulness is like parking our car a couple blocks away from our office and walking to our office so we can get a little bit of extra exercise in, or taking the stairs rather than the elevator to get to a higher floor in a building. So it's a way of integrating our physical fitness into our daily lives. It's not us going to the gym specifically to practice it, but we're integrating it in, finding other ways to improve our physical health and well-being while living our lives. Mindfulness is the same thing. It's our practice of being aware as we live our regular lives. It's not separated from our regular lives. It's integrated into our regular lives. This is important because this helps us in schools quite a bit, and it gets a little bit back to this why mindfulness thing. But not only is mindfulness an intentional awareness of what's going on around us, we're also intentionally trying to nurture or bring forward positive states of mind like kindness and compassion. In schools, these kinds of feelings of awareness, as well as kindness and compassion, are closely linked to social emotional learning strategies. So in the United States, we have something called SEL, social emotional learning, and it's all about ways that we can bring that kindness, compassion, and awareness into our learning environments. And here are some of the ways that mindfulness connects with that. So mindfulness brings forward and supports us to have self-awareness and self-management. It helps us to have social awareness, so awareness of others. It helps us to have improved relationship skills, and it helps us make responsible decision making. So these are other ways that when we cultivate this in our lives practice of being aware and being kind and compassionate, it has all these rewards for our interactions with others. So you can imagine at a school why this might be positive and something that we want to bring forward. I believe that mindfulness begins with self-care. So we had that Audre Lorde quote a few minutes ago when we talked about why mindfulness and why is it important. And I want to bring this forward again, and you'll hear it quite a bit. But I believe that being able to cultivate mindfulness starts with a willingness to take care of ourselves. And I define self-care as showing genuine care and concern for ourselves, treating ourselves like we would a loved one. So for us to start practicing mindfulness, we need to also start practicing care for ourselves, being willing to take care of ourselves. So here's why that's important. I think that mindfulness and self-care, when you bring them together, it does something really important and really powerful for us as educators. It increases our self-awareness. Here's why that matters. So when we're self-aware, we are able to have deeper relationships. We have deeper relationships with ourselves. So when we have increased self-awareness, especially when we meet that with care and compassion rather than judgment, we have a better sense of ourselves. And actually knowing ourselves better, even knowing the parts of ourselves that we're not so proud of, actually leads to increased happiness, clarity, and emotional intelligence. So just knowing ourselves better, being curious, being connected with ourselves helps us to feel better. That's for the self. Self-awareness also supports deeper relationships with others. So when we're self-aware, we are automatically and naturally more aware of others. And that self-awareness helps us to be more regulated and grounded as educators. So if I imagine this in the school setting, a self-aware teacher is more regulated and grounded. When they're more aware, when they're more confident and comfortable and calm, they actually create a setting within our classroom environments where kids can also feel like they are safer and they can support and they can show up as themselves more. So self-aware and regulated teachers actually create self-aware and regulated kids in classrooms. And we'll talk about how that is true in a little bit. This is a study that comes out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's a few years old, but it studied the impact of a group of teachers who practiced what's called mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's a kind of mindfulness practice, often paraphrased as MBSR. Is basically practicing mindfulness. They did a study on the impact of teachers who practiced mindfulness. And this is what they found. They found a reduction in burnout and symptoms of psychological distress. So if you remember what we just spoke about as we started our talk together, teachers are burned out. So practicing mindfulness helped to reduce that, very important. Mindful teachers also had improved classroom organization. So their classrooms felt cleaner, easier. Their day was more organized. They had more effective teaching behaviors. So they were able to be more effective as teachers just by practicing mindfulness. No changes to their instructional strategies overtly, but because of practicing mindfulness, they automatically became more effective teachers. And they also had increased self-compassion. So they had an increased sense of care and well-being for themselves. So let's talk a little bit about what embodiment is first. Here are two dictionary definitions of embodiment, and I'll pause for a moment and allow you to read them. And here's how I think about embodiment. Embodiment is a dynamic and integrated awareness of our inner experience. So our awareness of our emotions, our sensations, our thoughts, and our biases, as well as our outer experience, what's happening in our environment, what context are we in, what physical space are we in, who's around us, and how these experiences impact and are felt in the body. So when we practice embodiment, we're aware of our thoughts, we are also aware of what's happening around us, and we're aware of how both of those things are impacting our physical experience in our body. This is important because our bodies have a lot to tell us about what's going on. And if we can start to connect in with our bodies more, we're much more aware and we're able to feel better and be much more grounded. This is a quote from Margaret Wheatley, which I like a lot, that talks about why this embodiment, this awareness is so important. So she says, every one of us constructs a world and then lives inside our personal creation. Without training, we cannot see the richness of information that the world offers us. With practice, we learn to experience moments of direct perception, free of our filters and bias. And as we take in more of the world, our habitual filters lose their grip. Our actions become wiser, our compassion deepens, and our commitment strengthens. So Margaret Wheatley does a lot of work coaching educational leaders. She's also a longtime mindfulness practitioner. And what she's saying here is that embodied people, when we are self-aware, when we have that increased self-awareness, we're aware of all the different ways that we're experiencing the world based on our past. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the 3 I's. But that when we're not aware of all the influences that shape how we're showing up in the world or how we're experiencing things, then it's a little bit like we're going through the world blind. But if we practice that increased emotional intelligence, that increased self-awareness and embodiment, then suddenly we can see the world more clearly, and that allows us to act differently in the world. So a quick review of why embodiment is important before we move on, because I know I'm throwing a lot of terms out there at you. First, mindfulness leads to awareness. So through practicing mindfulness, we develop a greater awareness of our thoughts and our bodily sensations. This awareness leads to embodiment. So when we are more aware of our thoughts and feelings, we make wiser, kinder, and more informed decisions. And that leads to improved sense of well-being and improved relationships. And embodiment leads to inclusion. Over time, we're able to tap into this increased awareness on the spot, allowing us to create more inclusive and nurturing classroom environments. So this is why embodiment is important. Here's another reason why it's important. So again, I was talking a little bit about how as educators, when we're not aware, we can, through our own biases and thoughts, create unsafe environments because we're not aware of our thoughts and our reactions and how that's influencing us. That's one way. The other reason why embodiment is important is because it matters how educators feel in the classroom. As humans, we're a part of the mammalian nervous system, which is a collective nervous system. And basically what that means is subconsciously we pick up on and react to the cues of the people around us. Many of us have heard this, but a part of our brain all the time is scanning for safety. It's a subconscious part of our brain, and we're scanning in our environment for safety all the time. This was useful during early stages of human development, when we were living more in the environment and in the wild, and we needed to have some awareness of our physical safety and well-being so that we could continue to survive. So while we were picking berries or hunting for animals, a part of our brain was paying attention and scanning our environment to make sure that there weren't any threats that we didn't see. When we experienced those threats, we sensed a mountain lion behind us or a bear or whatever it is that was going to attack us. That part of our brain would trigger what's called the fight, flight, freeze response, which basically means that it would shut off the thinking or logical part of our brain and ready ourselves for survival, either to help us to fight, to give us a surge of adrenaline so that we are able to fight and defend ourselves, to freeze, which basically means to stop altogether and not move in order to take care of ourselves, or to flee, which basically means to leave, to run off as fast as possible. So when the fight, flight, freeze response is triggered, our thinking brain shuts down. Now, while that was really useful during early days as humans when we were trying to survive in the wild, that response still happens today, but it happens when we sense threats to ourselves based on other things. Like for students, if your teacher's in a bad mood, when they come into the classroom, that will send the kids into fight, flight, freeze response. Even if you're smiling on the outside, if you have this seething level of anger or frustration right underneath the surface, our kids aren't fooled. At least their subconscious minds aren't fooled. And they send their kids into that freeze response, fight, flight, freeze response. As a teacher, I discovered this. I didn't know what to attribute it to, but I definitely discovered this early on in my career. I remember so clearly one day I was just in a terrible mood. I had woken up in a bad mood. I had some things on my mind. I was dealing with some stuff in my personal life. And I went to the classroom and I remember thinking, all I want today is for things to go well and for me to be able to be calm and happy and just to get through the day. And of course, my students picked up on that mood. They picked up on how I was feeling, and the day was terrible. The kids that sometimes are on the edge of having behavior problems, of course, they had big behavior problems. Things broke down. Kids got into fights. You know, it was all the things happened that I didn't want to have happen on that day. At the time, I didn't know what it was, but I did understand that there was this direct relationship between my mood and what happened in the classroom. Now I understand it's this collective nervous system. So when we as the educators aren't doing well, then we tend to impact what's happening to our students. Our students respond subconsciously and they shut down and go into fight, flight, freeze response. So that's the hard side of that. The good side of that is when we're calm and regulated, so when we're embodied educators, when we're practicing mindfulness and we're aware and we're able to regulate ourselves and our emotions more, the kids entrain on that as well. So if we're in a bad mood, we can have things go badly, but we're in a good mood when we feel stable and calm, the kids learn to match that also. So through just our own energy and our own ability to maintain ourselves, we are able to change the environment in the room. In other words, when we use mindfulness to modulate our body's stress response, while we're working with kids. And we can stay in that window of tolerance, or in that ability to stay grounded and calm and regulated, when we can be embodied in that way, then our nervous system becomes the intervention in the classroom. Kids entrain to our nervous system, and it helps them to calm down and regulate their emotions as well. So it goes either way. It's going to happen whether we practice mindfulness or not. We might as well practice mindfulness, because it will help us to be more effective in creating safe and inclusive and calm classroom environments, which in turn will help us to do our jobs better. So it's a win-win all around. When we're more aware, as educators, when we're more embodied, we create safer and more conducive learning environments for everything else. What I didn't explain during the fight, flight, freeze responses, not only does our body ready ourselves for that survival, but our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, shuts down, because that part's not necessary. We don't need to do facts and figures and computations while we're trying to fight for our physical survival. So that part of our brain shuts down when we're in unsafe classroom environments. And when kids are in those environments for prolonged periods of time, that means they're not learning as effectively. Even if they're not physically doing anything, there's no visible signs of the fight, flight, freeze response in our students, they're not learning as effectively. So it's really helpful to apply mindfulness as an educator, because it helps us to feel calmer and more regulated, and that helps us to create safer environments for our kids that will help them to be relaxed and in a more receptive learning space. If we're also trying to add any other social emotional learning or any other kind of well-being strategy to our school, mindfulness serves as a really great foundation for that. So mindfulness, because it helps us to be more aware, it helps us to have these feelings of loving kindness towards others. Any other social emotional well-being approach that we may want to apply automatically can build on top of mindfulness. So mindfulness is just a terrific foundation. So how do you do it? That's the big magic question. How do you start practicing mindfulness, and how do you start integrating this self-awareness and emotional intelligence into our lives? Here's how I would say we do it. We do it through what I call using our 3 Is. This is a strategy, or kind of an analogy that I developed myself. Intellect, insight, and intuition. So intellect is that logical thinking and reasoning brain that we as humans have. It's a great part of our brain. It helps us to do all the things around us, create the internet, enables us to connect across time and space the way that we are right now, helps us with writing, all the things. So our intellect is really great. It just happens to be faulty. It doesn't always have all the information that we need. And sometimes it operates on false information. I won't get into that today, but our intellect is fine, but it's got its limitations. The second I is insight. And that goes back to Margaret Wheatley's quote a little bit, which is basically, we're heavily influenced by our earliest childhood experiences, by our culture and our norms, by where we grew up in the world, by our family values, and by the other experiences that we have, especially in the earliest part of our lives. They're so impactful that it's kind of like putting on a pair of colored glasses and going through our lives with those glasses. It literally shapes everything that we see and experience and feel, and how we interpret the things around us. When we start to practice mindfulness and start to gain some self-awareness, then we can start to see some of those things that are coloring our glasses and make some choices about whether or not we want to continue to have them doing that for us. The other part of insight is perspective taking. So it's learning to see the patterns in our lives, or for educators in our educational settings and our work lives, and learning from our past mistakes or our past accomplishments and applying that information forward. So that's insight. The third one is intuition, which has a lot to do with mindfulness, which basically means learning how to get out of our head and our intellectual thinking, that head fast thinking, and learning to slow down a little bit, and learning to connect back in with our bodies, learning from an embodied body around our felt sense about what's happening for us, and learning to listen to that quiet voice, the quiet nudging that's there all along. We need to slow down enough to listen to. It's definitely a really powerful and important bit of information for us, but it does require that we intentionally seek it out. When we have all three lenses and put them together, and I'd say the ideal is that we spend our lives using all three lenses all at the same time. That's what I call the three eyes, and it's what gives us three-dimensional seeing. So just like when we're looking at one of those 3D pictures without the 3D glasses on, you can kind of get a sense of what's going on in that picture. It's a little bit fuzzy and blurry, and the colors are overlapping in a strange way. That's kind of what it's like to go through life using one lens alone. You get a pretty good sense of where you're going or what's true and important for you, but it's not totally clear. But when you start to use all three eyes together and you're learning to see with this three-dimensional sight, it's like putting on a pair of those three-dimensional glasses. Suddenly that fuzzy image takes on a depth and perspective that you wouldn't have otherwise. You can see the dimensions, you can see around it, and it's kind of coming out at you. The same thing is true when we start to use the three eyes and start to look at our lives. Suddenly our challenges and our opportunities become much more clear. The places where we need to grow and develop become much more evident to us. And in our school and our educational settings, the places we need to go to grow and improve our school community also become much more clear. So they simply just help us to see things more clearly. Here's how this works in a school setting. I'm going to move my picture one more time. Okay. So this is the three eyes in education. So I'd say before, and it kind of goes back with my theme around like educators first, embodied and grounded educators, and the most important intervention in our classrooms and schools. The three eyes also begins with ourself first. As we begin to work with those three eyes and start to develop three-dimensional sight about ourselves, especially if we meet that with self-care and self-compassion, what happens is we gain this greater sense of ourselves and greater sense of self-compassion. We become our own friends, essentially. We start to become our own allies and our own buddies. When that happens, it actually enables us to open and see those parts of ourselves that we're less proud of, that we don't really want to see and acknowledge, that can be painful. So it helps us to see our biases. It helps us to see the places where those colored lenses are influencing us in a negative way. It helps us to see those patterns that have gotten in our way in the past, and it helps us to open up to feedback and to learning about ourselves more. It does this because suddenly we have our own back when we are self-compassionate, when we are our own friends, then it helps us to feel open to learning about ourselves and getting some of that feedback. This is important because it helps us then to do the schoolwork. When we're more self-aware and we're more self-compassionate, then we're better to work with. We're easier to work with. People enjoy working with us more. So that readies us for schoolwork. Schoolwork is really also starts with kind of those relationship building things first. So I'd say as we start to do schoolwork, whether it's in our classroom or in our school or in our larger organization, it starts with building a culture of trust and accountability. So we want to make sure that people feel safe and included and able to be themselves and show up as themselves in their spaces. So that's number one. The second is to have some accountability. So we want people to feel safe, and we also want them to know that we're going to keep them safe by making sure that norms and agreements around how we're going to treat one another are in place. Once that's there, that actually creates a space for culture and collaboration that wouldn't be there before. So it allows us to, when we feel safe, we're able to show up and collaborate with others, bring our full selves forward. And that allows us to do true transformation in our school communities. Because when we start to do that transformation in that work, inevitably something's going to come up that's going to help us learn about ourselves. It throws us back into that self-work again, gives us an opportunity to learn about ourselves a little bit more. The more we know about ourselves, the better able we are to do the schoolwork. And so on and on it goes, a self-work, schoolwork cycle. It can be helpful to think about this as a yin-yang. For some people, I think this is an analogy that's supportive for them. So basically, you can imagine that self-work side is the yin side. When we deepen our relationships with ourselves, we're able to transform our lives and our personal relationships. We fill our buckets. We take care of ourselves and give ourselves that sense of well-being and care that enables us then to go out into the world and do the yang part, which is to deepen our relationships with others and get in there and do the hard work of transformation and of school, of just teaching school in general. When we go out into that yang world and we're out with others, it requires that we go back and start to take care of ourselves again. So we need to return back to ourselves with self-care knowing ourselves, showing that compassion for ourselves, filling our own buckets, giving ourselves the reserves so that we can go back out into the world again. And it's a never-ending cycle. And you can also do what I call practicing inner being, and that's what we're going to practice today. It's be our last activity of the day today. Inner being is a concept that comes from Thich Nhat Hanh. And basically, he defines it as knowing and acknowledging that we interdependently coexist. And when we practice inner being, we honor the interdependence we have with one another and all other aspects of our planet. So basically, we understand that we're not alone. And not only do we understand that we're not alone, we act accordingly. This can be really helpful because I think often people struggle because they feel alone or isolated or separate. But when we practice mindfulness, and specifically when we practice interbeing, we recognize and understand our relationship with others. And here's a practice you can do. I'm going to model it for you, but you can do it with almost anything. But I like to call this one the inner being of our morning beverages. So you can do this as well, right alongside me. But for me, one of the things that I love most, it's a core part of my routine every morning, is I have a cup of hot tea in the morning. So I'm going to imagine the inner being of how that cup of tea arrived to me. So if I were to sit and think about how that cup of tea comes to me in the morning, a few things become very clear to me right away. First of all, I think back on how the leaves got to be produced for that tea. So I'm going to go all the way back to the origin of the tea leaves. So I can imagine that somewhere in the world, people are growing the tea plants that are going to produce the tea leaves, are going to become my tea. So I can imagine into the people that are tending to those plants, planting the seeds, watering them, nurturing the tea plants, and picking the leaves and processing them, turning them into tea leaves. I can also imagine all the animals that are a part of that, right? So there's insects, other animals that are moving in amount around the tea leaves, supporting them to grow. The soil itself that is nurturing those tea plants with nutrients from the soil, the cooperation with the sun and rain that's bringing necessary light and water to those plants. So already there's a lot of different people and energies and entities that are supporting my tea leaves to come about. But I can imagine once those tea leaves have been processed and dried, then they get packaged. And once they've been packaged, then they need to be transported somewhere. So now I can imagine all the different people and entities that are responsible for making sure that that tea gets packaged and shipped appropriately. So it goes from a processing plant to probably a distribution center, and from the distribution center probably to another distribution center, and then finally from that distribution center to my home. That's hundreds of people that have been associated with that step in the process of my tea, right? All the different people that were required to make sure that the tea in its little tin arrives at my home. And then I can imagine all the different people that helped beyond the transportation of my tea that are cooperating every day in my ability to have my tea. So there are people that are making sure that the water is clean that I use to brew my tea, and that I have access to electricity to enable me to heat up the pot to brew my tea, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine right away, that's a lot of different people and energies supporting the inner being of my tea, supporting me to be able to have that tea in the morning. And when I think about it in that way, I can't help but feel a deep amount of gratitude and kind of awe at how many different energies supported me to be able to have something that I enjoy so much. And when I remember that, I feel connected to the larger world and I feel better. So I'll pause for a moment and give you a chance to practice the inner being of your morning beverage, whatever it is. Try to imagine into all the different people and animals and the earth that are contributing to it. I know that's not enough time, but it's just a starting point. An example I always love to share is that Einstein, I believe, was practicing inner being. He didn't call it that. He called it gratitude, which is another way I think of thinking about inner being. And he had a goal, it is said, of saying thank you 100 times every day. So he made it a point to say thank you all the time, acknowledging all the different ways that he received things from other people. I have tried this. I have yet to reach 100 times a day. I continue to make it my goal. But just imagine what it would be like to go around and notice all the different places where people are supporting you and saying thank you, either to them directly or just thank you in your mind. So thanking the people that are maintaining the roads or are keeping electricity on in our offices and other spaces, the people that created your computer. Just imagine acknowledging all the different contributions that have led to the things that you're experiencing. Einstein attributed these habit of saying thank you to some of the reasons why he was able to tap into the knowledge and the insights that he had. So it's just something to consider and play with. The other side of inner being is recognizing our impact on others. So we can recognize and appreciate the impact, the positive impact people have had on us. But the other side of the inner being is recognizing and understanding the importance of our impact on others. So another way of practicing inner being is by being a good steward of the earth, trying to have as least an impact as possible on the earth as we live our lives, being an embodied educator. So acknowledging the impact that our energy and mood has on our students and making a choice to be different and trying to be more positive and grounded and supportive to our students. It's acknowledging the impact on our collective energy when we put negative energy out into the world rather than positive energy out into the world. So inner being is a great place for us to kind of stop our talk for today, because that's really, I think, where we're at as a world. The pandemic helped us to remember this, that we are all interconnected. And so when we remember that we're all interconnected, then we also remember our responsibility to take that interconnection seriously.